Greetings sailors and welcome to a view replay of the most boring battleship at tier 8, which is quite the feat considering it had the famous and historical HMS Monarch as competition. This is the Kansas. You are all probably well aware of the deficiencies of this ship by now, and this is Menthel playing it, and I think we've had Menthel in the Kansas before. We've had somebody sent a Kansas replay. It's definitely not the only one I've featured so far this year, and this is going to be, fortunately and possibly oxymoronically for a Kansas, actually quite a short game. It's not going to be drawn out, although it probably felt quite drawn out when Menthel was playing it, because that's just the nature of the Kansas. It does at least have a good range, but all of these ships kind of needed a good range to make up for quite how glacially slow they are, and on top of that he also has got a spotter plane available, although given the lackluster-ish nature of these shells, the longer range you're firing out against, certainly the slower, more armoured targets that you're more likely to hit, the less effective your shells are going to be, just because they just, you know, they lose penetration, they lose energy. So it's kind of a mixed bag having such a long range with such relatively crummy guns, especially when you have that long reload as well. You don't get to have as much use out of your spotter plane as something with a quicker reload. So far he's had one Citadel already. I mean, against cruisers the lower penetration isn't actually a bad thing. More pen isn't always better, as people who have played the Roma, for example, will know all too well. Sometimes certain guns have all the penetration, but that then just means that they overpen everything, which definitely isn't so much an issue that you have with the Kansas so much. We also get to see another feature of this ship here, in that it has got a defensive, again of somewhat dubious value, especially on a battleship. At this stage of the game, when he really hasn't taken many hits and certainly hasn't been subjected to any AA spam, it's going to actually be by far at its most effective. But of course, by the time you get to the end of the average battle and you've lost quite a lot of your many squashy AA mounts, which are fairly numerous on this ship, but it doesn't have lots of durable dual purpose secondaries. It is more the kind of 20 mils and 40 mils, if memory serves, which get knocked out very easily, and so the value of the defensive just goes down increasingly over the course of the average game, which is unlike pretty much every other consumable, apart from kind of the heal. I mean, the heal, it really depends on the type of damage you're taking. If you take lots of heavy damage and Citadel damage, then obviously you're not going to be able to heal much of that back. So I guess that's kind of arguable that the heal falls under that category as well. But yeah, there's nothing like that as applies to, say, the Hydro or, you know, a reload booster or any of the other consumables, speed booster, etc. So yeah, it's kind of a not that useful consumable to begin with, and then just the nature of the squashiness of AA mounts means that it's probably by far one of the least useful ones in the game overall. But hell, if you've got it, you might as well use it for all the good it'll do you. It'd be interesting if you could swap that with another consumable that might be you know, a bit more interesting to use. Can you imagine this with the speed boost, for example, even if it was only another couple of knots? And it's not like it's completely unprecedented for a US battleship to have a speed boost, but yeah, I think it really is just the Georgia, isn't it? So as much as it would be fun to imagine these things with a speed boost, I don't think that would be likely for Wargamers to give it, because everyone would just ignore the defensive and use that instead. I suppose it's nice to get something, I suppose, but it's just not a very useful something. I mean, the Italian battleships, by contrast, although the gunnery is quite frequently frustrating in terms of the accuracy, the creeping smokescreen can actually be very, very useful for disengaging and buying some time to heal up. In terms of stealth firing, not so much with a battleship, but it does still have some utility, and certainly more utility than the defensive AA. Hell, these things with a creeping smokescreen, I mean, it would be very creeping given the speed of them, but you know, that could be something potentially that would be a bit more interesting. This is shaping up to be maybe a bit of a one-sided fight. I mean, it's a standard game. Standard games are always a bit weird. The enemy team doesn't seem to have committed particularly hard to either flank, but that could be said of this team as well. They don't seem to have gone heavy on either side especially. I mean, I think there were actually more allied ships on this flank than there are on the other flank, where they're playing quite defensively. But either way, it's a bit, I don't know, the enemy team is playing more defensively overall, whereas Menthel and this other couple of allied ships, including some ships they've lost, are actually now just pushing up. I think the fact there are carriers in play, and it was what, one destroyer per side? Was it two? Two destroyers. The enemy team's lost their destroyers, so yeah, that's just made the rest of the team very, very shy about going forwards, even though there are no more destroyers on this flank generally, because the two allied teams' destroyers kind of split themselves equally. So they could have been a bit more pushy here, but no, they're just letting this group of ships press forwards, and so the amount of operating space they have is getting lower and lower, and they're just steadily losing ships. This is where the range of this thing actually comes in quite useful. All Menthel really needs is the spotting, and he can shoot at most of the things that are actually spotted. Of course, whether you can actually hit or not is another matter, given the ability of things to dodge out the way over these longer distances, but still, sometimes RNG will bless you with a random citadel on something, and in that case it was actually that topped up his damage enough to net him the Confederate, and he has been just steadily plinking away at everything and actually landing damage with his guns. Now, I think this was a prior patch replay. Yeah, this one's been sat on my hard drive for like a month or something, or the footage has. So yeah, this is before the advent of Deadeye, or is it actually? No, the most recent patch was the graphical update, wasn't it? Was this post or pre-Deadeye? I genuinely can't remember. Because I was gonna then say, oh yeah, this is, you know, showing that you don't necessarily need Deadeye for long-range battleship fire, although obviously some RNG involved. But it might be this was a game post the Captain rework, and that he does have Deadeye. I just honestly can't remember. But if there was a line that was going to benefit from the most from the current state of Deadeye, then it absolutely would be the slow US battleships. But of course, with the nature of Deadeye confirmed to be being changed in some way, although we don't know what Wargaming is considering exactly, it's possible that whatever it is, and it is a much needed change, but it's possible that it will hurt these ships a bit, so maybe they could do with some slightly better accuracy at some point. I don't know. Anyway, this is just mopping up at this point. I mean, they've still only lost 2 ships. The enemy team is rapidly running out of hit points, ships, and room to maneuver. And this is really, I think, the enemy team's failure. So this was not a close game at all. And yes, you do tend to get some weirdness in standard games, but the enemy top tiers absolutely did not play even remotely aggressively at any point. They were just so passive for the most part, and it's completely cost them the game. So yeah, don't play like this, I guess, would be the takeaway from this game. I mean, the reason why Menthel sent this in was not because it was a close result, it's because it's a Kansas game with lots of damage, but it's definitely not a thrilling game. You know, the result is good for a Kansas, there's no doubt about it. But this was absolutely not a thrilling game, both in terms of it being a Kansas and it being a bit of a ruffle stomp, let's be honest. I mean, he's barely taken any damage himself in this one. People just really haven't shot at him. I guess they've concentrated on the cruisers that have been nearby. And he has, throughout all this, I mean, he's always been near allies. He's always been angled well towards the enemy. So even if they had shot at him more, if they'd chosen to pick out him amongst the ships he was next to, I think he still would have been pretty healthy at this point. I don't think he would have been in much danger of getting sunk unless he got detonated or something. I think this is the first time the carrier, we've seen them come over here with anything but torp bombers, and because it was dive bombers, they were directly, you know, overhead all the AA, and he actually managed to gobble down that entire group without the benefit of the defensive. So when we saw him using the defensive earlier, it wasn't like it was any particularly great shakes, but yeah, they don't have to get quite as close. So just the enemy carrier left, and I'll tell you now, they're not going to get to kill it. He does still have the range though. He absolutely does still have the range. But they start moving just at the point where they get spotted by planes, so yeah, even a carrier's acceleration is enough that unless you get some very wonky RNG on the shots in terms of splaying them out particularly far, no, they all miss. And that's definitely a frustration when you're playing a battleship with such a long reload, and that partly goes for the Italians as well. Most of them have got longish reloads. With wonky accuracy and long reloads are not a fun combination. So 150k in the end there, and a Confederate, and what is undoubtedly a very good damage result for a Kansas. But if this had been anything other than a tier 8 game, this probably would have been considerably less fun. If it had been less of a ruffle stomp, well, it might have been more interesting to watch, but the Kansas under any kind of sustained fire doesn't do very well. It really doesn't. It cannot run away. If you're in a position like this where you can just keep pushing forwards and be on the offensive, it's fine. But if you're ever in the opposite situation, it's pretty dire, as I'm sure anyone that's played this line or any slow battleship will all too well be familiar with. So that is that for this replay. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and if you did, you can do all the usual things down underneath it, and of course, as always, stay tuned for more.